Due Process, winner of 19 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights and the 2011 Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Discussion Series. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
Mr. Ravi will report to the Middlesex County Adult Correctional Center to serve as part of a probationary sentence, a 30-day jail term.
Darun Ravi didn't pull real prison time in his Rutgers roommate suicide, but the case attracted national attention. 3 Morristown teens charged with assault in the wake of their alleged victim's self-inflicted death. And a major documentary underscores the devastating consequences of what kids can do to each other. Is child-on-child abuse on the rise, or are we finally facing a long-time problem? Bullying, and the increasing efforts to combat it on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
Today, as we tape this program, a trial begins in Morris County. 2 17-year-olds accused of bullying a high school freshman, a boy who days later killed himself. It drives home, yet again, both the agony bullying can inflict on its victims and New Jersey's new tough response with its Bullying Bill of Rights. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King. And on this edition of Due Process, the shocking suicides and the more common, less sensational, but constant cases of kid-on-kid abuse. But we begin appropriately in Morristown.
We obviously believe that he was in an intimidated environment, that he was preyed upon.
A Morristown high school freshman found hanging in his bedroom. Authorities say he'd been robbed, assaulted, bullied by fellow students in the weeks before his suicide.
We have an individual who was assaulted in the school. That, by definition, fits the bullying statute.
3 students charged with robbery, theft, and terroristic threats.
The vitriol involved in some of these things, I think, makes the bullying quotient much worse today.
The death of 15-year-old Lennon Baldwin, an all too familiar story. The charges brought on the heels of sentencing in an earlier case. Another teen suicide that shocked New Jersey and the nation when college freshman Tyler Clementi jumped off the GW Bridge, just days after his Rutgers roommate secretly recorded, posted, and ridiculed Clementi's sexual encounter with a man.
So did you deliberately set this up to spy on this guy?
I didn't set up the computer to spy on him, but yes.
And a disturbing new film underscores the extent of bullying.
They punch me, strangle me, take things from me, sit on me.
Give it to him hard!
And unchecked, just how far it can go.
A Perkins boy, just 11 years old, believed to have been desperate enough to take his own life.
So the documentary Bully was the film of choice when this Bergen County Assemblywoman brought hundreds of kids to a screening.
I welcome all of you again, and I ask you to really take this seriously. How many here in the audience have been bullied? Raise your hands. All right, keep those hands up. How many here have witnessed an incident of bullying?
Quite frankly, there's no place to be safe anymore, and schools are supposed to be a safe environment. When you see kids staying home from school because they're afraid to go to school And when you see other victims taking their lives, it's quite tragic.
It was Huddle who was the principal sponsor of a new state law, one requiring that anti-bullying programs start well before adolescence.
Give me my hat! Give it to me!
The idea, to start early in combating the isolation and abuse that's been linked to mass violence.
They just started coming in the library and opening fire and shooting off bombs.
God, not at Columbine, you know? It happens in some other school somewhere else. It doesn't happen here.
To personal tragedy.
Some kids have told him that he's worthless, to go hang himself.
And most often, to the kind of grinding cruelty that can make school a sad and scary place to be.
Is that perfume I smell? You know you're boring, don't you?
And not just on fiction television.
It gets better. It gets better.
It does get better.
That message addressed especially to gay kids, who too often are the targets.
Practically the whole elementary school was behind me screaming, "Very, very." And I was just walking there.
Oh my God.
Like I didn't know what to do. So I just walked home. That was 7th grade.
A phenomenon we've been documenting since due process has been on the air.
Getting spit on in the hallway, being called a faggot, queer, fairy.
But the recognition of what gay kids go through has now gone mainstream.
Like all of you, I was shocked and saddened by the deaths of several young people who were bullied and taunted for being gay, and who ultimately took their own lives.
As has the awareness that all bullying is serious.
There were these kids at my school, like my preschool, who'd like chase me around and like push me on the ground.
It wasn't fun. I got hurt so bad that I had to stay away from school for like a week.
Most of us have been in a bullying situation, so we know what they're going through.
I feel angry when she tries to take the ball out of my hand, so I want her to stop.
Here in Glen Rock, Bergen County, bullying's been under attack for nearly a decade, since New Jersey's first anti-bullying law.
They said, we want to call it On Guard. We want to be on guard, which I thought was kind of cool because it's kind of like they're guarding their classmates.
Parents understand that there's a real limit here of tolerance and that really we have zero tolerance for things that could really substantially hurt a child.
And the latest legislation on the heels of the Clementi suicide has been called the toughest in the nation.
This law was the great equalizer. This law is now saying that this is the standard, this is the bar, this is what you are required at a minimum to do. They're serious about investigating it, and if it's criminal, pushing it to law enforcement, and if it's not criminal, addressing it. It gave them the moral back.
But the so-called bullying Bill of Rights is prompting its own share of controversy. Some say it asks too much of schools, especially the provision that makes the school responsible for bullying on its premises and off.
We were first dealing with bullying in schools, then we were dealing with cyberbullying, and then you're dealing with bullying on weekends, on vacations, outside of school. You know, when are schools just going to substitute for parents altogether?
Then there's the money. The bill passed overwhelmingly, but with zero funding.
The state has given us this law with no funding. This component of education is so important, but it's not attached to any money.
So the governor came up with $1 million. With 2,500 schools in 590 districts, critics say that's just not enough.
No, this $1 million isn't even close to enough.
Not enough with the bullying Bill of Rights expecting schools to accomplish the near impossible, overhauling the underside of kid culture.
They knock things out of my hand. They punch me in the jaw. They think that I'm not normal.
If we want to call it rite of passage in the sense that it's always occurred, it has always occurred. It's not a rite of passage. It's a passage into hurt. It's a passage into depression. It's a passage into lifelong scars in many cases.
The goal?
Hey, Hannah, I heard that you don't have any friends, and I know that's probably true.
To make bullying simply unacceptable. Through a mix of early intervention.
Is everything okay?
And zero tolerance for bullies.
We need to start building moral courage in the students to be able to know in their hearts when something wrong is happening and have the courage to step up to the plate.
Kids, when they don't get help with bullying, it might never stop.
Everything starts with one and builds up. Eventually we have an army.
No one argues in favor of bullies, but how bullying should be handled, that brings a range of response, as we're likely to see right here in the studio.
Dr. Stuart Green is director of the New Jersey Coalition for Bullying Awareness and Prevention, an organization he founded in the wake of Columbine. He is also associate director of Overlook Family Medicine Residency Program. Dr. Stephen Sussman, a clinical psychologist, is founder of the Child and Teen Success Centers in New Jersey and New York. And Teresa Moore, a legal expert on the Bullying Bill of Rights, is senior research analyst with the Rutgers-Newark Institute on Education, Law, and Policy. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Stuart, let me start with you. You saw that Prosecutor Bianchi is all-in supporter of the bill. The bill, on the other hand, has its critics, either in terms of its being underfunded, arguments that its scope is too broad, including activities outside of school and in the cybersphere, and also some questions about whether it is somewhat bureaucratic in nature. Do you think those criticisms are well-founded, or is there a response to them?
This is a great law that's already had a very positive effect. It's known as the strongest anti-bullying law in the country right now, and for good reason. Basically what the law does, as good laws do, is it expresses society's intent for educators and schools to pay much more attention to the issue of bullying, which is really the issue of whether children are adequately engaged in school and adequately supported and included and protected during their life at school.
So I gather that you like the bill, but have reservations.
I don't have reservations about the bill. Like all good law, it'll be inevitably followed in years to come.
The funding, the bureaucracy, none of that bothers you, and the reaching out well beyond the school doors.
I like funding. I chaired the government commission whose report was provided the basis for the new law. And in that commission report, we certainly asked for some funding to set up training centers in each of the regions of New Jersey. But that's secondary and not a primary issue. When educators ask for money to do this job, from my point of view, an advocate's point of view, they're basically asking for additional money in order to do something that ought to be fundamental to what it means to be an educator and fundamental to what it means to have a school.
But has not been to date. So Steve, let me ask you, I think your concerns go well beyond whatever minor concerns we might be hearing from Stuart.
Yeah, well, basically, I've been in this field for many, many years, worked with many kids, and I'm head of something called the Success Center. Our whole orientation is to empower kids. I've seen countless kids. I have a colleague who does the center with me, and he's actually goes and lectures the country about...
Izzy Kelman.
Yes. And there are methods that I'm not saying are the only thing we should teach these kids, but when I looked at the law, when I hear about the law, and I'm not a lawyer, is that they're going to be putting these very high standards and demands on school and hold them very responsible, which in some ways is a good thing, but I don't know how realistic it is. Like, parents can't get their own kids to behave. Parents can't get siblings to treat each other well. Now we're expecting schools to be able to control kids all over, out, cyber. I'd rather at least see some training for the kids to know how to handle a bully and be surprised. I don't see it. I see studies that are done that have much more of the approach of what we're talking about here. There's an Oveus program that's been the gold standard. It really basically is where the school's taking over and the kid goes and reports it and people are supposed to intervene. And the results of the research, I have them here, is they're dismal.
Let's come back to that.
Does this law, Teresa, in your view, extend into the family? I mean, is it going into areas where we expect families to perform a function, or is it targeted to what the school can do, and are there mechanisms to make schools better at doing it?
The law is targeted at schools, school-sponsored events and activities. Those may be off school grounds or they may be on school grounds, but they do, it does include those events, as well as some behavior that takes place in cyberspace. So if...
And that may have nothing to do with school.
Well, the
Facebook,
way that the law
Twitter.
works, or as the way it's intended to work, is that if behavior that falls under the definition of bullying or harassment or intimidation occurs off school grounds, but it has a substantial effect in the school environment or harms a student in school to the extent that that student can't learn or access education, then schools do have to act.
Stuart, let me ask you a question.
I just want to comment on the cyberbullying issue, because there's a myth about that. Almost all of these electronic forms of bullying are occurring between kids who know each other from the same school buildings and the same communities, and almost all of the cyberbullying, so-called, either precedes or follows actual harm between kids in the same schools, in the same communities. So that's fundamentally why it makes sense for schools to address it. And when it does occur, when kids are hurt in this way, through electronic means, alteration of websites, cell phone usage that's inappropriate, etc., it almost always creates substantial negative impact for the students involved, the one being hurt particularly, and for the school. That's why that's in the law.
I wanted to get away from the cyber issue and go back to the question of discretion under this law. It seems to me that there can be areas where you're putting tremendous discretion on a school administrator to make the judgment about how to take an incident and handle it pedagogically as opposed to punitively, or how to find that balance. How do you train people, and how do you select people capable of doing that within a school structure?
You know, the thing about this is most of what's needed in order to address this issue adequately is the knowledge is within the educational and the academic educational community already, which has to do with paying attention to the social and emotional status and functioning of the kids in your care and knowing them and what their lives are like in school. We're really talking, when we talk about bullying and harassment, intimidation, and bullying, which is almost always a pattern of acts over months or years hurting a kid being hurt, not one incident. We're talking about a quality that in education we call engagement. Which is the extent to which the student feels involved with the life of the school.
If in place already is a responsibility for teachers and administrators?
I agree with you completely. It's a shame that we need this law. We have this law.
But you think we did?
We need this law. In 2002, Senator Bono and others, and we're grateful to them, passed the first anti-bullying law. And at that point, New Jersey was one of only about 20 states in the nation that had an anti-bullying law.
In the interest of time, let me just say, it was after the Tyler Clementi suicide.
This law?
That this law
Yes, of course.
comes.
Let me just make one
Raymond,
point. I should make a disclosure that I've done work with Rutgers University in connection with the Tyler Clementi case.
Yeah.
And also that the extreme result, the extreme circumstance that Tyler Clementi, and in this young case in Morristown, a life was lost, doesn't mean that there's been legally established a causal relationship between the two, but it drew attention to other circumstances, which are what we're talking about.
Yes.
And Raymond, let me go to Steve, because it sounded to me like much of what Stuart was saying about having to change the culture is what you say.
Well, I'm changing from a different direction. I want to go right in with the kids and help them see. We call it cognitive behavioral therapy. You modify their belief system. Right now, I'm afraid these programs are teaching kids to expect to always be protected, taken care of.
Shouldn't they be?
Well, I think we have to treat resilience, how to handle an enemy or a person giving you a hard time.
Toughen the kid up?
No, I educate them, give them more options. We're right now, in my mind.
So then what does the bullied kid do? There's a package that you and Izzy actually sell to school districts. What do you say that the kid who's been bullied should do and how the school should respond?
Well, ideally the school would have a good anti-bully program in place that has, that according to research has worked. And our program has not been adequately researched. We're just two people. But I go through there are studies, meta-analyses, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on these programs. They're minimal results. So how do we know now?
This approach that New Jersey's taking. You say it doesn't work.
Approaches.
Could you just tell me simply at its core what's the flaw in this approach?
Basically what it's doing, it just isn't working. In other words, it's not been proven to my satisfaction, I know we differ on this, that you can institute a program and successfully lower bullying to a substantial amount. So what I think will happen is that parents will be furious because their kids are going to be interrogated, they're going to be treated a little bit like almost a criminal, and then they're going to say, well, wait a second, my son was bullied last week by that kid. In fact, that kid is getting revenged on my son, so I think that we're really going down a road that's going to lead to a lot of difficulties.
Teresa, let me just bring you in here. The language interfere with the orderly operation of the school, which is part of the key to this statute. From a lawyer's point of view, sounds very broad. That is, as a litigator, I'm not an educator. That sounds like it can capture.
And I'm a former litigator.
Oh no, I wasn't
agree with
trying to.
I agree with
but you wear 2 hats, or maybe 5, so you're much more educated than I. From a pedagogical point of view, the question is, how do you make that decision? Because I have seen some instances where, in my mind, it wasn't clear to me that administrators knew when there was an intervention that could be a teaching experience and when some kind of punitive action needed to be taken. And that's a very difficult judgment to make. How do we get people in the framework of this statute or in some other to making that judgment better?
That's an excellent question. I think that there is a lot of discretion that is built into the statute for administrators and teachers and others in schools to decide whether or not there is substantial disruption in the disruption of the school order, or whether there's demeaning or humiliating conduct. But any professional ought to be able to make that judgment fairly easily, it seems to me, though there is some discretion. We use in the law the reasonable person standard all the time to determine whether or not somebody has rights or those rights have been violated. The same idea has been brought into this statute in a sense. And what this law says is that where whatever behavior occurred in school or out of school is motivated by someone's protected personal characteristics, race, age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability. The same categories, for the most part, that are in the law against discrimination that we've had in place in New Jersey for many years, those that apply also to children are now in this law. And we're saying if conduct, whether it's verbal, physical, some other electronic communication, if it impacts or is motivated by someone's personal characteristics, then the school, and it's demeaning or humiliating, it can create a hostile education environment.
Stuart, is this whole bullying impact greatest on gay kids? And how do you feel about what we saw in the Tate piece, which was the It Gets Better campaign?
Well, those are 2 questions, but in general, as kids that are seen as not fitting masculine or feminine sort of stereotypes, certainly kids in the LGBT community are one of the groups most hurt by this issue in schools, and kids with special health and learning needs, the special education population, are the other groups. So those are the 2 peak groups. In terms of the It Gets Better campaign, I mean, I love the work of Dan Savage, and I think it's a good campaign. The only thing is there's an edge in that campaign. He can't address everything. That sort of, in a certain way, takes it for granted that we're not going to be able to change the status quo adequately anytime soon. And he may be right about that, but that's the issue that we'd like to go after, getting schools to do what's right to protect kids. I also want to comment on the resilience point about kids' resilience. If you think of a special education population as being especially hurt by this issue, and again, we're not talking about one incident that happened yesterday, almost never. We're talking about kids.
90 seconds. I'm so sorry.
We're talking about kids who have been hurt for months and years, typically, who have been desperately trying to think of everything they could possibly do to get this to stop. The idea that resilience is what's going to protect them and not the responsibility of the adults who control the setting they're in, I think is, it's outrageous.
Steve, your answer to that?
I know the population is talking about. I work with them every day. That's a different situation. I have Asperger's kids who these things backfire on.
I'm sorry, our time is running out, so just tell me quickly. How do you respond directly to that?
They have to be protected. That subpopulation.
By the school?
Yes, but the rest of the kids who are not like that, I think that we cannot hold that same, we can't treat, I don't think it's going to work with those kind of kids.
So does the Bullying Bill of Rights deserve to survive, and will it? Quickly.
Yes, and modified.
Yes, absolutely.
I think there's a place for it.
And when we come back here in 5 years, will bullying be off the table in a way that it was before?
Absolutely not.
Clementi?
We're more at the beginning of this movement to address bullying adequately in the U.S. than we are at the middle or the end.
Well, I think the subject is deep enough that we could go on forever. But
And
certainly we'll
hopefully
have to,
come back.
And certainly revisit it. And we've been at this for 10 years on this subject.
Indeed.
My thanks, even given the short time, to Stuart Green, Teresa Moore, Stephen Sussman, and all of you for watching. For Sandy and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown, and we hope you'll join us here next week.
I'd like to have something that's like a bullying court. And you can have a multiple disciplinary team approach, is what we call it, where we have people that are members of the law enforcement community, education community, probation community, psychiatric community, and kids that are at risk for being bullied or being bullies. We can go over these case studies and develop individual plans to try to make sure we can keep them away from it. Look, I know a lot of people think that this is over the top. I know a lot of people think, why is the county prosecutor's office being involved in this? I'm prosecuting murder case. I just got done trying a murder case myself personally. We're doing all this stuff that we're doing. But the bottom line here is that this is a vulnerable group of people, just like the elderly are a vulnerable group of people, and they can't defend themselves, and somebody has to step in, because you can't educate if you don't have a safe educational environment. Period, end of story.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.